The river was already swallowing her when he jumped in, the cold slamming into his chest like a wall as the current dragged the black luxury car sideways, and the woman inside pounded on the window in pure terror. And in that split second, he did not see a billionaire chief executive or a powerful woman whose name would later dominate headlines. He saw only a human being about to die. So he wrapped his arm through the shattered glass, felt the bite of broken edges tear into his skin, and pulled with the kind of strength that comes from a man who has lost too much already, dragging her free, just as the vehicle disappeared beneath the water. And when they finally collapsed on the muddy bank, she was shaking violently, soaked, barely conscious, while he tore off his jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around her shoulders, turning his back to shield her from the onlookers gathering. And it was then, through chattering teeth and raw fear, that she whispered the words that would haunt him later. Words not born of desire but of humiliation and survival. "Will you stay if I undress?" Because she was freezing and ashamed and powerful no longer. And he answered without looking at her, without a second of hesitation, that he would stay, because that is what decent people do. And he stayed while emergency lights painted the riverbank red and blue. Stayed while she was treated. Stayed while reporters shouted questions he ignored. Then quietly walked away before anyone asked his name, returning to his small apartment where his daughter slept curled against a pillow that still smelled like her mother, who never came home from the hospital 3 years earlier. And the next morning he returned to his life of construction shifts, packed lunches, and school drop-offs, believing the river rescue was just another thing no one would ever remember, until weeks later when he was summoned unexpectedly to a corporate tower he had only seen on television, standing awkwardly in borrowed shoes across from the same woman, now composed and commanding, yet with eyes that softened the moment she saw him. And in front of a room of executives, she told his story not as a miracle, but as a lesson about what it meant to be stripped of power and saved by someone who asked for nothing in return, revealing that she had searched for him not to reward him with money alone, but to offer him a chance, because she had learned his wife had died, that he was raising a child alone, that he had once studied engineering but left school to work when life collapsed. And as the room fell silent, she offered him a position, not out of pity, but respect, saying that the man who stayed when she had nothing deserved a seat at the table. And as his life slowly transformed with stable hours, dignity, and the ability to be home for bedtime stories again, something else changed too. Because the woman who had once whispered in fear now visited the small park where he read to his daughter, sitting on a bench at a distance at first, learning how to be human again herself. Until one evening she admitted that the river had not only nearly taken her life, but exposed a loneliness she had buried beneath success. And he confessed that saving her had reminded him that he was still capable of stepping forward instead of shrinking away. And in the final moments of the story, years later, as his daughter stood on a stage accepting a scholarship, and the woman who once drowned in silence applauded beside him, it became clear that the question whispered by the river was never about undressing at all, but about whether someone would stay when power was gone, when pride was stripped away, and when all that remained was a human being asking not to be abandoned. And he had stayed, and because of that, everything changed. Years passed, but the river never truly left either of them, because some moments carve a permanent shape into the soul, and long after promotions, headlines, and quiet dinners replaced chaos, he would still wake some nights hearing water rush in his ears, while she would pause whenever rain hit glass too hard. And it was during one of those late evenings after a charity board meeting, when the building had emptied and the city lights hummed below, that she finally said what she had never said out loud, that in all her years of success, acquisitions, and public praise, no one had ever stayed for her when she was powerless. Not her former partners, not her colleagues, not even her family. And that night by the river she had expected him to look away, to leave, to protect himself first. But he did not, and he listened without interrupting because grief had taught him the value of silence. And he told her that after his wife died, he learned that staying did not mean fixing everything. It meant bearing witness. And slowly their lives began to overlap, not as a headline or a fairy tale, but as two adults rebuilding from different kinds of loss, sharing coffee after work, school plays, hospital fundraisers where no cameras were allowed. Until one afternoon his daughter asked him why the woman who once almost drowned always smiled when she saw the river from the bridge. And he realized the answer was simple and true, because that was where fear ended and choice began. And in the final quiet scene, years later, when the same river flowed calmly under a wide summer sky, The three of them stood together watching sunlight ripple across the water, no longer symbols of rescue or power or tragedy, just people who had learned that the bravest thing anyone can do is stay when walking away would be easier, and that sometimes the moment that almost destroys you becomes the place where your life finally begins. Time did not stop with that peaceful ending, because life never truly does. And the real test came when the world finally learned pieces of their story through rumors and half-truths, headlines whispering about favoritism and motives, forcing her to stand before a boardroom that questioned her integrity and him to face parents at his daughter's school who suddenly looked at him differently, and in that pressure cooker moment she offered him an escape. A quiet exit from her world so his life would not be complicated by hers. But this time it was he who surprised her, because the man who once stayed in silence by a river now spoke with steady resolve, telling her that he had lost enough by running from pain and he would not teach his child that love was something to hide when it became inconvenient. And together they faced the storm openly, refusing polished statements and rehearsed lies, choosing honesty instead, admitting they were imperfect, that their bond was born in fear and choice rather than strategy. And when the noise finally faded, what remained was smaller but stronger, fewer invitations, fewer admirers but deeper trust. And in a closing moment that echoed the beginning, he returned alone to the river one early morning, watching the water move the same way it always had until she joined him, quietly slipping her hand into his without ceremony. No questions, no dramatic words, just presence. And as the sun rose, they understood something neither power nor survival had taught them before, that love was not the moment of rescue or the promise of forever, but the daily decision to stand beside someone when the world has finished watching. The final chapter unfolded not with applause or grand declarations, but with quiet consequences and earned peace. Because after the noise died down and the curious eyes moved on to the next spectacle, reality settled in with its simple demands: school mornings, late meetings, unpaid emotional debts, and the slow rebuilding of trust with a child who had watched everything silently. And it was in one ordinary evening, while sitting at a small kitchen table helping with homework, that he realized how far his life had shifted. Not because he had saved someone important, but because he had finally allowed himself to be seen without armor. And she felt it too when she traded chauffeured rides for grocery store aisles, learning the language of normal days and small joys, understanding that love was not proven in crisis but in consistency. And when months later they returned once more to the river, not as survivors or symbols, but simply as two people who had chosen each other again and again, he did not need to ask why she stayed, and she did not need to test his loyalty, because the answer lived in the way they stood side by side, steady and unafraid, knowing that the most powerful thing they had built was not a headline or a miracle, but a life where rescue was no longer needed, only honesty, patience, and the courage to remain.